I'm Dorothy Kaczynski. I'm the Radenberg Director and CEO of the Phillips Collection. And I'm so glad that you've made the time to join us this afternoon for a terrific program focusing on our concurrent exhibitions, David Driskell and Alma Thomas. So that David Driskell, Icons of Nature and History, is really the first comprehensive examination of that wonderful artist's paintings, collages, prints, and drawings. We know him as an artist, an art historian, and an educator. And the exhibition is organized by the High Museum of Art in Atlanta and the Portland Museum of Art in Maine. We're so pleased to be able to present it in Washington at the Phillips during our 100th anniversary year. It's really a way for us very meaningfully to honor that our beloved friend. Alma W. Thomas, Everything is Beautiful, chronicles Thomas's dynamic art-filled life and the multiple facets of her creativity, from making art to gardening to teaching and community service. This beautiful exhibit is co-organized by the Chrysler Museum of Art and the Columbus Museum of Art in Georgia. These two artists were great friends. They were, each of them, Howard University graduates. It's wonderful to bring together this friendship in the galleries of the Phillips. They are members and proponents of the DC art scene. They exhibited together. They visited local museums like the Phillips collection together. Driskell was a big supporter of Alma Thomas's art in the 70s, and gradually she rose to national prominence. So I should say because I am personally very grateful to Howard University, all of my distinguished colleagues at Howard, for their generous collaboration on this program and so much more. We're really so thrilled to be able to work with such distinguished colleagues and to enhance our partnership and collaboration going forward. A special thanks to Dr. Lisa Farrington and Dr. Gwendolyn Everett for working closely with our Phillips staff. This afternoon promises to offer enlightening sessions that will explore how these artists connected to Howard University, to the themes of spirituality, to identity, and to each other. The program will conclude with a reading of an excerpt of a poem by Ross Gay, written in honor of Alma Thomas and accompanied by music and dance. This work was created and performed by Howard Theater art students for this program exclusively. I thank you so much for joining us. And now I would like to welcome my distinguished colleague, Dean Lisa Farrington. And I hope you enjoy this program. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dorothy. It's my honor on behalf of Howard University to welcome all of our participants and viewers to today's collaborative event between Howard University and the Phillips Collection. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, panelists, and moderators from both institutions, and I know that our viewers will enjoy this special tribute to two stellar artists, educators, Alma Thomas and David Driskell. I am an alum of Howard Fine Arts. I was a student of Dr. Driskell's, and I'm just delighted to participate and engage with these exhibitions and with the Phillips, as we all are at Howard. So allow me now for our first session to introduce you to Curator Renee Maurer from the Phillips Collection. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much, Lisa Farrington. Hi, I'm Renee Maurer, and I'm the coordinating curator of the Alma W. Thomas Everything is Beautiful exhibition on view at the Phillips. Welcome to our first session. It's entitled Howard is Home, and this session will examine the importance of the Howard University Fine Arts Department, its faculty, and the Howard University Gallery of Art in the lives and careers of Alma Thomas and David Driskell. Our speakers for this session include Mr. Scott Baker. Mr. Scott Baker is the Chief Curator at the Howard University Gallery of Art. He earned his BFA and MA from Howard, and he will speak about the history of Howard's Gallery and Alma Thomas. I will then follow him, and I will discuss Alma Thomas and her collaborations with Howard and Shaw Junior High. And then our third speaker will be Dr. Abby Iran. Dr. Iran is the registrar at the Howard University Gallery of Art. She earned her PhD and MA from the University of Maryland College Park. Dr. Iran will discuss Driskell and his connections to Howard. Please share Mr. Baker's PowerPoint. Thank you. Mr. Baker, begin.
First of all, I would like to thank everyone for including me in this wonderful presentation. And what I would like to do is to try to get a lot of material in at a very short period of time. So the first slide that you see on the screen is very important to us in the history of the art department at Howard. The art gallery was founded in 1870 by General Howard. General Howard is the person that started the university. He was a Civil War hero, Medal of Honor winner. He was appointed by President Lincoln to be in charge of 4 million freed slaves, which was called the Freedmen's Bureau. And when he was appointed, the first thing he did was to start a university. Next. This is the first art gallery. It is also the first university building. It's called University Hall, of course. But if you look closely on the 5th floor, that was the original art gallery. It was called the Historical Picture Gallery, and it included 5 rooms of art that was given to General Howard. He had many friends who wanted to be involved in it. So it was a very, very educational, and in General Howard's words, an enlightenment for the students. Next. This is Professor James Herring. We can't say enough about Mr. Herring because he did everything. He created the he created the Department of Art in 1922. And he was the one who also created or reinvented, if you will, the art gallery in 1930. But he was very much involved in everything and anything and everything that had to do with supporting and enriching Negro art and art by Negroes. This is our most important person. I had the pleasure of discovering this image in a university yearbook. This is Gwen Bennett. She was the first permanent faculty of the university, and she was the one that really influenced Alma Thomas as a student. She was the one who taught watercolor design. She was a writer, she was a poet, but she also was a great teacher. She was the one that decided, and the university accepted it, to have the students design and draw images for the annual yearbook, the Hilltop. This is the school where they really began the art department. It was actually is the engineering building. It was called Applied Sciences Building. It had a wonderful skylight, and it was used for engineering and architecture, plus the art department when it first began. Next. This is a better image. This is what the classroom looked like when Alma Thomas was a student. Uh, all of the things that you see in this classroom were gifts to the university, plaster casts for drawing. They never seemed to complain about lack of equipment. So if you didn't have an easel, you could just make do with a chair. Mr. Herring, as you can see in the smock in the center door, was the one who decided to have live models for the art students. And the model that you see is Maurice Hunter, who was very prominent in New York at the time. So it is really something as an evolution of the art department to see this image. Next. This is the result of Gwen Bennett's influence in the art department. This is the 1923. Now remember, she was only there 1 year when this was printed, but this is the 1923 yearbook, the Bison. And what this particular page states is that after only 1 year, it made a professional statement that said the art department will supply the education for students to make money in the world of art. And of course, Alma Thomas is the very last one on the right. These are the students that helped design the images that you see in the yearbook, especially the logo. Next. This is an image of the graduating seniors. And Alma Thomas is the first one to the left in this particular image. And in those days, you would have a statement about what you wanted to do in life. And for her, you know, what is more far-reaching more than beauty? So she still follows that philosophy today. And again, the images of this where you have the surrounding images of HU at the top and the all over image is all, you know, it's her doing as a student. Next, please. Moving on, 1930, Mr. Herring decided to ask the university to reinvent the art gallery from the 1870s building. Now, the 1870s gallery only was around for 3 years. There was a financial crisis at the university. All of the things in the gallery were transferred to the library. So Mr. Herring, because he taught architecture students when he first came, contacted his colleague, the architect of the university, Albert Cassell, to ask him to design an art gallery somewhere on the campus. And what he came up with was an ingenious plan to utilize the unused basement of the chapel. And this is the image of the art gallery in the chapel. Directly in front of you, you can see the offices of the director and the storage rooms. And to the right, you will see what is called the little gallery. So this particular art gallery included 3 rooms of exhibition space, rooms for the offices of the directors, and storage rooms. And Mr. Herring, again, was always influential because he was the only Black member of the College Art Association. And he made friends with those people. So they were very, very, this is the Alma Thomas that we know. At the height of her career, she had this portrait done by Laura Wheeler Waring. And it really shows her as a determined and very, very exciting junior high teacher.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. You're at time. Is there a summary that you can, or a last slide that you can move to?
Well, the most important thing is that Ms. Thomas received the first Outstanding Alumni Award for all of her work. And the last thing is the success of her work that has always been sold. Now, this particular work is called Alma's Flower Garden, and it took her 2 years to do, from 1968 to 70, but it broke all of the records for auction at the Aaron Payne Gallery in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it sold for $2.8 million. So it's really a grand statement and a summation of her career.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. For this topic, I want to acknowledge I'm sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulties now. For this topic, I'd like to acknowledge Rebecca Van Diver and Seth Feeman for their research. Alma Thomas made quite a first impression, as we learned from Mr. Baker. She made quite a first impression on James B. Herring, the director of the Howard Fine Art Gallery and Department. Herring remembered this encounter as having vivacity, character, and richness to an association which endured. Herring mentored Thomas, who after graduating became an art teacher at Shaw Junior High School. Though she left her alma mater, Thomas remained linked to Howard for decades. Beginning in the 1930s, Thomas utilized her relations with Herring to create a bridge between Shaw and Howard, one that offered opportunities for young students to experience and exhibit art in segregated Washington. Thomas and Herring forged alliances to enrich the roster of activities held during Negro History Week, inaugurated in 1926 by Carter G. Woodson. They tapped into Howard's resources and the expertise of newly hired art faculty, James Porter, Lois Mayo Jones, and James Lesesne Wells, and later worked with Alonzo Aden, curator of the Howard University Gallery of Art, which opened in 1930, as Mr. Baker had said. By 1930, Negro History Week was introduced into Division 10 through 13, the designation given to DC public schools for Black students. Thomas became an organizing committee member for the week's events at Shaw, a position she held for 10 years. In her role, she engaged students inside and outside the classroom, activities she documented in her papers. To inspire her students' study and participation in art, she managed exhibitions at Shaw, referenced in pamphlets made for Negro History Week and standalone brochures. One of the earliest examples is Shaw's Negro History Week brochure from 1930. It indicates Thomas directed a small exhibition in the art room titled Negro Art and Artist, perhaps the first occasion she assembled a show at the school, which became an annual event. In 1931, Thomas exhibited at Shaw the art of Herbert Daniel Rogers, her former student and a recent Howard graduate. The cover of the brochure features Thomas's name and title, indicating her leadership of the project. The Washington Post announced the exhibition, the events for the week, and that Carter Woodson spoke at the assembly. Herring then organized at Howard's Gallery art exhibit, The Public Schools of the District Columbia. It displayed works by elementary, middle, vocational, and high school students, and the brochure highlighted Thomas's role as an educator. A year later, Thomas featured watercolors by Howard art students, another exchange in the growing collaboration between Shaw and Howard. Herring cultivated relationships with local educators, and in 1932, the Afro-American relayed his initiative to mobilize a movement of 100 Howard University and DC public school teachers charged with promoting art education through exhibits and lectures. Thomas ran the personnel committee for this task force. In 1933, Woodson's Association of Negro Life and History recommended that courses in Black history be taught in public schools and advocated that each school should have an art gallery. That year, Herring partnered with Howard Art Department to curate the exhibition of works by Negro artists at the National Gallery of Smithsonian Institution, sponsored by Woodson's Association. One of the largest and most successful early exhibitions in DC to feature the work of Black artists, it grouped together paintings by Archibald Motley and Hale Woodrow with examples by Howard faculty, among others, and works by some of Thomas's students. In 1934, DC's Assistant Superintendent of Division 10 through 13 schools, Garnett Wilkinson, declared support for art galleries in every junior and senior high school, setting the stage for a temporary art gallery at Shaw. Events for the 5th annual Negro History Week in 1934 included 3 exhibitions planned by Thomas: watercolors by Howard professor Lois Mayo Jones, creative illustrations based upon African art designed by students of Thomas, and pictures showing outstanding achievements in the arts by African Americans. For these activities, Thomas engaged in printmaking with students to create art covers for both the Negro History Week and the Lois Mayo Jones brochures. By 1936, the Shaw Art Gallery became formalized, as noted in the Negro History Week brochure. This act positioned Thomas as an innovator, the founding director of the first art gallery in a DC public school. Also that year, Thomas organized the School Art League at Shaw, which brought students to DC's cultural destinations. The league's success grew from the network Thomas forged between Herring and Aden. As the program encompassed more schools, hundreds of students visited an array of institutions, including Howard's Gallery, the Central Public Library, the Smithsonian, the Corcoran, the Freer, and the Phillips Collection. In Thomas's archives, the Shaw Bulletin detailed Saturday mornings from March 1937 to June 1939, boys and girls aged 11 through 16 could be found at Howard, where Herring and Aden taught. Aden's lectures covered art from the Hall of Negro Life at the Texas Centennial, which also included works by Thomas's students. Beyond the league, Thomas also supported and exhibited at Shaw work from her summer art programs at Southwest Community House. In 1937, Thomas presented her most important curatorial contribution at Shaw's Gallery, the work of outstanding Negro artists. It featured examples from the Hall of Negro Life and from Herring's 1935 exhibition of Negro paintings and paintings of Negro subjects. As project lead, Thomas used her connections with Herring and Aden to secure these impressive loans for Shaw students. Key paintings by Motley were on view, including The Liar, Saturday Night, and Barbecue. At the time, Howard Loan inquired in 1934 from the Corcoran's National Exhibition of Art by the Public Works of Art Project. Active in DC in the 1930s, Motley taught and exhibited at Howard and painted a mural for the Frederick Douglass Memorial Hall. Malvin Johnson's Booker T. Washington, featured at the PWAP exhibit, was also on view, as was Earl Richardson's employment of Negroes in agriculture. Following this success, Thomas held month-long shows at Shaw's Gallery. The networking of Thomas, Herring, and Aden found its ultimate expression in the administration of the pioneering Barnett Aden Gallery, the first Black-owned commercial art gallery in DC, directed and managed by Herring and Aden in their private home just southeast of Howard. It opened on October 16, 1943. Alma Thomas was the gallery's primary funder and founding vice president. The Barnett Aden exhibited works by artists of all races, but it aimed to, quote, present the achievements of the American Negro in the United States in the realm of art, end quote. It developed from partnerships in place, nurtured at Howard and throughout the city. Teamwork at Shaw may have acted as a catalyst for something larger and more impactful. Thomas may have made curatorial decisions at Barnett-Aiden, considering the experience that she gained at Shaw. Some of her Shaw students, like John Farrar and Bill Taylor, found support at the gallery. Throughout her life, Thomas fostered important relationships, and in 1953, at Barnett-Aiden, she met David Driskell, who worked there. They learned how much they had in common. Both born in Georgia, moved to DC, graduated from Howard, and had strong ties to the gallery. Driskell and Thomas went to museums like the Phillips, exhibited throughout the city, and together at Barnett-Aiden's Contemporary American Artists Group, New York and Washington in 1956. Driskell would go on to promote Thomas's art at Howard, Fisk, the Whitney, the Corcoran. They stayed in contact until Thomas's passing at Howard University Hospital in 1978. In the end, Howard had been their home, had offered them opportunities, and had helped to connect them all. Dr. Iran will go into details about Driskell and Howard. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. It's now a rather well-known story. David Driskell, coming from North Carolina, arrived at Howard 3 weeks into the term in September 1949. He had made the last-minute decision to attend and had therefore not applied in advance. This photograph shows Driskell, who's the furthest to the right, with peers on campus at the dial, a sundial at the center of the quad. Driskell officially matriculated in January 1950. His first university art course was held on the 3rd floor of Thurkield Hall, the science building, which was also housing the art department. Driskell was taught here by the artist and professor James Lassane Wells. Here is an early still life by Driskell, russet and gold, from his student years in 1952. Professor James A. Porter, pictured here next to his painting On a Cuban Bus, persuaded Driskell to change his major to art. Porter, an example of dual commitments to being an artist as well as a scholar, inspired the young Driskell. Porter had written a foundational text on the history of African-American art, which was published in 1943. When it was reissued in 1992 as part of the Moreland Spingarn, the Howard Library series, it had an introduction penned by Driskell. Here's Porter's On a Cuban Bus next to Driskell's student work, Still Life with Eggs. This side by side tickles me. Porter's depicting a chicken and Driskell's eggs, considering Porter's formative mentorship relationship with Driskell. I also think this comparison displays how Driskell's style came to echo some of the elements of his teachers in the arrangement and modeling of forms in terms of color palette choice and use of outline, and how background and foreground are set out. Artist and Professor Lois Maylou Jones was also teaching at Howard. Jones encouraged her students to paint on plein air, and Driskell remembered how she would take them downtown to DC to paint the streets like she herself had done in Paris. Here is another teacher-student side-by-side. You can see in the study of Driskell's his formal consideration and working out of the architecture of the cityscape. The entire art department faculty recommended Driskell to attend the residency program at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Maine over the summer of 1953. After returning, Driskell was elected president of Howard's Daubers Club, quote, organized for the purpose of stimulating interest and aesthetic culture. The club's revitalization was reported on in the university newspaper, The Hilltop, by fellow student Mildred Thompson, herself on the road to becoming an esteemed artist. Here we see Driskell on the right at a student exhibition opening next to a beaming Porter, the university president, Mordecai Johnson, and Johnson's wife, Lois Jones, and a man named James Jones, who supervised art for DC public schools. Driskell graduated in 1955 with a bachelor's degree in art. Here's his yearbook photo. He was offered and accepted a faculty position at Talladega College. While at Talladega, Driskell exhibited his work back at Howard in a show called New Vistas in American Art. This exhibition was the first ever held at the Howard Gallery's current home in Childers Hall. In 1962, Driskell earned his MFA from Catholic University and returned to Howard as a full-time faculty member teaching painting and art history. Driskell's notable students from Howard include Lou Stovall, Lloyd McNeil, and Sylvia Snowden, whose mature style is represented in the work you see here. Also, artist Mary Lovelace O'Neill was a student, and she was of the opinion that Driskell led an art history course that was really sort of a civil rights course in disguise, or as she put it, quote, an action course. Driskell also grew Howard Gallery's permanent collection while serving as its acting director. Using gifted funds, Driskell acquired examples of work by Romare Bearden, Alma Thomas, and others. Driskell wrote the introduction to Alma Thomas's 1966 retrospective at Howard. And then at his next university post at Fisk, he would curate a show of Thomas's work. In the Everything is Beautiful catalog, Rebecca Van Diver has written how this show at Howard, quote, marked the start of Thomas's meteoric rise in the art world. Driskell also continued his work as an artist. This is Chieftain's Chair, which is in the current exhibition. The scrolled elements of the chair design, as well as the patterned collage paper in the central oval, contribute to the dynamism of Driskell's abstracted depiction of an upright regal seat, which Julie McGee has suggested relates to West African chieftains' chairs that Driskell would go on to collect. African art had and still has an important presence at Howard's Gallery, where with a core collection that grew out of the bequest of Professor Alan Locke, who's known as the Dean of the Harlem Renaissance. Driskell left Howard in 1966 to teach at Fisk. Here he is at his going away reception next to his beloved wife, Thelma, who's wearing a dress that he had hand painted and which is now in the collection of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Versions of some of those arched and rounded shapes and marks from Driskell's Chieftain's Chair also appear in this unique article of clothing. There is no separating Driskell's Howard education and training and the mentors he found from the history of African American art that he crystallized during his career, in part through exhibitions he curated, especially 2 centuries of Black American art. To offer one example, as you recall, Driskell's first art professor was Wells. In 1965, while Driskell was faculty at Howard, Wells' painting Salome was on the cover of his Howard Gallery solo show. Over a decade later, the painting appears in the 2 Centuries exhibition, it's second from the right here, as part of a larger narrative that Driskell showcased. Obviously, this was an immense and ambitious exhibition, but this is far from the only example of this ever-lingering Howard presence in Driskell's career. To bring things full circle, here is Driskell back at the dial, nearly half a century after the initial photograph I shared with you. His connection to the university continued well beyond this point through honors and exhibitions and through the legacy of those he taught, advised, and influenced, both directly and indirectly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Professor Japa Dawuni. I'm an Associate Professor of Political Science at Howard University and the Director of the recently launched Center for Women, Gender, and Global Leadership. It is my honor to be here to moderate this panel, which is Alma Thomas, Self-Fashioning and Identity. The 2 presenters I will briefly introduce are Dr. Elka Stevens, who is an associate professor and fashion design program coordinator in the Department of Arts at Howard University, and currently a critical race studies artist in residence at Michigan State University. The second presenter is Dr. Baba, who is an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Art History at the University of Delaware, as well as a curator in residence at the Delaware Contemporary. I would hand over now to Dr. Baba, who will present her work titled, which her work looks at and discusses how Thomas used photography and self-fashioning to project her identity. Over to you, Dr. Baba.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending. I'm going to share my screen. Just a thanks really quickly to Adrian, Renee, and Miguel for inviting me to share my work on Alma Thomas today. I'm really honored to be here among such esteemed colleagues and to celebrate these two giants of African American art. My short talk today is titled Alma Thomas's Quiet Self-Fashioning. My use of the word quiet follows cultural and literary studies scholar Kevin Quashie, whose groundbreaking theorization of the discrete expressions that Black cultural producers cultivate mitigates assumptions about the publicness of their identities. A metaphor for Black interiority, quiet characterizes one's desires, ambitions, and fears, thus enabling a more nuanced understanding of Black cultural production. My mobilization of quiet also builds on historian Darlene Clark Hines' work on Black women's inner lives in the early 20th century. For Hines, putting on appearances became an artful survival strategy of disclosure, whereby Black women promoted an openness about themselves and their feelings while actually remaining an enigma to the outside predominantly white world. And Thomas mobilized performance in photography and in her paintings in similar ways. For exhibition openings and other photo opportunities, Thomas often dressed in specially designed outfits featuring colors and patterns that matched or complemented her paintings, like the ones you see here from 1968 and 1972, about which we will hear more later. From incorporating theater into her teaching and imitating quote unquote master modern artworks to stylish self-fashioning, she self-consciously performed various aspects of her life. These creative pursuits illuminate how, in the face of representational mandates levied at Black artists and women artists about the kinds of images and selves they should present, Thomas publicly expressed what her mentor, James B. Herring, called, quote, the complexity of her spirit. Through quiet self-fashioning, she contested the social expectations of modern art, Blackness, and womanhood at the time. Yet her carefully constructed self-presentation has largely gone undiscussed in art historical and museum scholarship, despite renewed and ongoing interest in her abstract paintings. Much of the existing literature on Thomas's eclectic tastes and influences, from modern technology to color theory, focuses on her vast art historical knowledge and the books in her collection. Scholars and critics have also examined the veiled racial consciousness of her paintings, her teaching, and her local activism. Focusing on her self-fashioning enables us to see how Thomas unsettled the illusions of transparent representation that were attached to race, gender, and form at the time. In putting on appearances, she also articulated her aspirations for mastering the art of class and career advancement. And this quote appears in a typed untitled document in her papers archived at the Smithsonian Institute's Archives of American Art. And I'll just let you read it very quickly. This quote underscores how Alma Thomas routinely sought newness and inspiration outside of the material limits of fine art to craft a unique aesthetic experience to both painting and her own identities. In a Black and white photograph taken at the 1934 World's Fair in Chicago, the artist peers beyond the frame. Compositionally centered and not quite in profile, the middle-aged artist appears composed, in control of her image. She wears a patterned day dress belted at the waist and smiles slightly, effortlessly, at the edge of the fairgrounds on the shores of Lake Michigan. Fixed in time, this vision of quiet equanimity echoes the stillness of the landscape. Her brimmed hat, long-sleeved coat, and high heels are fashion forward. Poised and posing, she looks to what lies ahead. This picture is quintessentially Thomas. Well before she garnered fame for her abstract paintings, the artist pursued progress through self-fashioning and other activities that positioned her at the cutting edge of modernism and identity expression. Like many African-American visual, literary, and performing artists active during the 20th century, Thomas was self-consciously aware of the publicness of her presence in white male-dominated art forms such as abstraction, as well as in the wider world. Part of this awareness stems from common yet narrow assumptions about the expressive currency of Blackness as loud, dramatic, and even defiant, assumptions that often restrict or dismiss African Americans' inner lives. According to Kevin Quashie, these assumptions are symptomatics of the quote, of the politics of representation, quote, where Black subjectivity exists for its social and political meaningfulness rather than as a marker of the human individuality of the person who is Black, as if there were no inner life, end quote. Thomas's rejection of this kind of imperative to represent is well documented. She strove to live a vibrant life, unbound by narratives imposed by American society's limited conceptions of Blackness and womanhood. Being called a Black artist rankled her, as did social dogma about her gender. As her friend artist Lou Stovall recalled, quote, "People would think, how can she paint at the edge if she's already outside? Washington is tough on women artists. The pasture is so small," end quote. Thomas's age and location further marginalized her. She lived in Washington, D.C., which compared to New York City and Paris at the time was not seen as an art market epicenter. In defiance, she looked beyond herself to nature, technological innovation, and space, its dimensions and arrangement on canvas, as well as the boundless expanse of our universe and its exploration. For Thomas, skyscrapers, airplanes, telephones, and rockets, along with abstract expressionism, represented new modes of modern being, of progress. In pursuit of art and life on the edge, she also carefully composed her self-image. Thomas's pose, dress, and attendance at the World's Fair in 1934 are early examples of the way she navigated the publicness of her identity as an artist, as a woman, and as an African-American. The first 2 decades of the 20th century brought more education and leadership options for African-Americans and for Black women in particular. Thomas and her sisters benefited from this shift when their family moved from Columbus, Georgia to Washington, D.C. in 1907, seeking relief from racial violence in the South. Access to such opportunities affected Black women's style. By 1934, women's fashion had left behind the flapper girl silhouettes of the 1920s, as well as consumers' desire for multiple changes of clothes to match various activities throughout the day. In the wake of the Great Depression, everyday women's fashion responded to the times. Garments that could be worn over the course of the day for multiple activities began to emerge, and sophisticated day dresses like the one Thomas wears in this photograph became popular because of their versatility. Most importantly, these dresses were made for public display and to convey the social status of the wearer. Dress and photographic portraiture as vehicles for communicating status and selfhood held special meaning for African-American women during this era. And as Thomas's 1934 portrait suggests, the fair midway at Chicago doubled as a fashion runway. Black women used their newfound mobility and increased wealth to buy day wear, a fashion trend previously and exclusively worn by their white counterparts. Mostly seen in work uniforms and casual clothing during the week, Black women flaunted their finest threads during out-of-town trips, at church, at weddings, and at other social and leisure events on the weekend. Stepping out or wearing nicer clothes in public became commonplace. For Thomas, stepping out and being seen were not only opportunities for Black expression, they signaled achievement and racial progress. Of her time in New York City during the Harlem Renaissance, she wrote, quote, "I remember dressing up in my beautiful dresses made for me by my mother and strolling up and down 7th Avenue and Lenox Avenue and 125th Street in Harlem. It was one big continuous party. I had never seen Black folks so happy and enjoying the big city life," end quote. Back home in Washington, the sharp decrease in employment options in the wake of the Depression gave rise to local and national efforts to organize play and wholesome leisure activities for African Americans. Taking advantage, Black Washingtonians turned the street into a theater by dressing up and stepping out en route to social clubs, restaurants, movie houses, and dance halls. African Americans affirmed their social status along with the primacy of being seen by exhibiting style and grace on the street and at social events. Thomas actively participated in this cultural phenomenon. Her sartorial choices articulated her middle-class sensibilities and aspirations. Being seen was also part of Thomas's experience of the art world. Although she netted unprecedented visibility and success in Washington's budding art scene from the 1940s onward, Thomas was a woman of her time. Stovall's words remind us that Washington was hard on women artists, and the same could be said for artists of African descent. Despite the mobility they enjoyed in the still segregated city, the overwhelming whiteness and maleness of the art world, and of abstract painting in particular, made Thomas stand out in a way that aligned her presence with protest in the minds of art world insiders and the general public. Remarking on Thomas's position, art dealer Michael Rosenfeld has stated, quote, "Her decision to be an abstractionist was in itself a major social political statement, that a woman of color can be part of the larger picture of American painting," end quote. These are the politics of representation. As such, Thomas's career trajectory has become a touchstone for women African Americans, and older artists who are often excluded from or positioned outside the art historical canon. But Thomas, as a riposte to the beleaguering burdens of representation, preferred formal innovation and subtle yet cutting-edge performances of the self to make her mark. She was, in critic Ken Johnson's elocution, a euphoric modernist who believed in art's capacity to transcend political realities and unlock humanity's infinite potential. Painting, she told journalist H.E. Mahal in an interview published in 1970, released her, quote, from the limitations of the past and opened the doors to progressive creativity, end quote. Marked by a continuous evolution in style, the artist's approach to art and life vis-a-vis painting, fashion, and photography evokes senses beyond the visual that expands abstraction's dynamism, as well as how we understand the politics of identity in the past and present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baba. That was an excellent presentation, and thank you for the time. I'll hand over now to Dr. Elka Stevens, who will discuss her work in recreating Thomas's dresses for the exhibition. Dr. Stevens.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Dawuni. Before starting, I must take a few moments to make just a handful of acknowledgements. I would first like to thank the administrators as well as my colleagues at both the Department of Art and Art History and Design at Michigan State University, as well as my colleagues in the Department of Art and the Chadwick Boseman College of Fine Arts at Howard University. Seth Feeman and Jonathan Waltz, I thank you for giving us a personal experience and in allowing us to engage with Alma through her art and her artifacts, including the recreated garments. I have to, of course, acknowledge my family, particularly my parents and circle of dear friends for their unwavering support. I also want to thank the leadership and curators and others at the Phillips Collection. It's an honor to be a part of the exhibition as well as the panel today. Finally, I would like to thank each one of you who's here joining us virtually. So my presentation today is going to focus on recreating the day dress as well as the Whitney gown for the exhibition Alma W. Thomas, Everything is Beautiful, which is currently on tour, but currently at the Phillips right now. My presentation, there we go, will proceed as follows with some initial thoughts about dress and dressing in our society. After sharing a little bit about how I became involved with this project, I will focus on my own creative process, the conditions under which these garments were produced. It's been a challenging couple of years. And if time allows, I'll touch on some of the unexpected outcomes of this type of work, particularly as it relates to pedagogical changes as we seek not only to tell the story of Alma Thomas and other Black artists in conversation with her, but also as we seek to decolonize our curriculum and educate our students across institutions. Finally, I'll end with a few closing remarks. Oops, sorry. To begin, I was given a charge to create the garments, but it was not without quite a bit of preparation for this particular task. The first thing is that textiles and clothing are central. Textiles and clothing is very central to what I do. I use textiles and clothing as a lens of analysis, as well as media to organize the world around me. It is the basis of my teaching. It's the basis of my service, my professional development, my research, as well as my creative production. I'm fascinated by, and some would suggest that I'm obsessed with, textiles and clothing as tools that we use to form the basis of the mundane, everyday act of dressing. And I'm using a basic definition for dressing in this, being a communicative process that provides insight into our real and aspirational identities that are contextually dependent upon time, place, space, audience, and purpose. Moreover, textiles, clothing, and dressing embrace all aspects of our everyday lived experiences. They impact all people in all walks of life without respect to race, creed, gender, class, sexuality, marital status, age, education, military service, etc. Textiles and clothing operate in both the Hessian and Hermian domains, often intersecting to blur the lines between the public and the private. Dressing oneself and others is a frequent response to external and internal stimuli, and seldom represents a single moment or thought or operates in response to a single or an idle gaze. Typically, textiles and clothing and the practices associated with them represent a culmination of thousands, if not millions, of micro decisions, some of which are conscious to us and others which are not. Some decisions we can claim as ours, but so many of the decisions are under the influence of others. Nonetheless, there are many frames of reference that inform our decisions and our actions on a day-to-day basis to determine the manner in which we will choose to present ourselves. And it's the interpretation of those decisions that provide a platform for an interdisciplinary and a global discourse about micro and macro level phenomena. In short, dress matters. So in the beginning of this process, the collaboration began with an introduction to the curators and creators of the show, Seth and Jonathan, at a Starbucks coffee shop on the campus of Howard University. Introduction was given by Dr. Melanie Harvey, a colleague in the Department of Art, from whom you'll hear a little bit later. It was a chilly morning in the first part of December in 2018. And like many of you, I knew who Alma Thomas was. She was the first graduate of Howard's Department of Art. She was the first Black woman to have a solo exhibition at the Whitney, first African-American female to have a work featured in the White House. And there were so many other accolades that were associated with her. The curators at our meeting already had several ideas for how they wanted to engage the audience with Alma Thomas's work, some of which were very popular and well-known and others not as much so. But the inclusion of the dresses was an extra element to engage the viewer and give us a little bit more insight into the life of Alma Thomas. So with that, I received a charge to create these two garments. So we have what we term as a day dress, and we don't know who the designer for this particular garment was, as well as what has been labeled now as the Whitney gown. And this gown was designed and sewn by Maceo McCrae, and we really don't have a lot other information about that. In the months to follow, in the process of getting ready to take on this charge, I took it upon myself to learn quite a bit, or as much about Alma Thomas as I could. Soon, I didn't realize at the time, she would become one of my favorite artists. Due to the time, I won't go into all of the details for everything that I learned about Alma Thomas, but I did learn a few things I think that are worth noting. Number one, I learned that I had a lot in common with Alma Thomas, and at many times it seems as if I was following in her footsteps along her life's journey. I also learned that she was just not a phenomenal artist, but also a race woman. And getting to know her was the first step in the process for me being able to create the pieces. So with that, I was provided with, oh goodness, a series of images that showed Alma Thomas at different stages of her life. And I could see patterns within the photographs that I was seeing, many to which Dr. Barber addressed or alluded in her previous presentation. It was very interesting to me to see particularly the garment that we labeled as a day dress, in which she was conducting her work during the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. I'm sure there were other garments in which she worked before and after, but it seems as if that probably 3 or 4 year span, we typically identified and saw Alma in her studio in this particular style of dress. Now, it wasn't uncommon. I can recall my grandmother wearing these short style, loosely fitted cotton house dresses because there were different types of clothes, different categories of clothes to which you wore when you perform particular activities. And I'm sure that this dress gave her some assurances and no worries with regards to being able to maintain her other fashionable clothing that she had in her closet. I would suggest it was probably comfortable. It was also colorful, and it was also something that she could wear in public. I should mention as well, it photographs quite nicely and shows in black and white too. And this checkerboard pattern, interestingly enough, I think is important to note. It was reminiscent to me when I viewed it of the Deep South. And when we see her in other photographs, we can see a variation of the checkerboard and other heavily graphic patterns in her clothing. I also make the connection that this geographic patterning that we see was akin to some of the shapes that we see in her work, particularly when I gaze at red azalea singing, dancing rock and roll music, and red sunset. It resembles an abstraction of a checkerboard patterning, and also stylistically what we see in the Earth Cities and some of the other pieces that resemble these elements. So in trying to create the garments, it was important to look at the images, examine the motifs, think about the textiles that were used, understand how the garment was made. And always for me, the next step is to write descriptions in that before I actually begin to create a graphic and create the pattern, order supplies and finalize the pattern and actually go on to construct the garment. So for the descriptions, very briefly, I determined that the day dress is going to be a bold, repeating 3-color block patterned, loose-fitting A-line, lightweight, short sleeve, just below the knee length, breathable, casual house dress featuring a broad scoop neckline with a small V, detail in the front of the neckline made from a plain weave cotton. And similarly, the Whitney gown was a vibrant, multicolored, repeating pattern, fitted floor length, elegant waist gown with piping details around a modified V neckline and waist, under bust, level depth opening, modesty insert, set-in sleeve with jewel tone button closure at the cuff, and made from some type of knit fabric as far as I could tell based upon the imagery. The smock design was a challenge to create, or interesting to create. It has a repeating pattern, but it's not an easily recognizable alternating pattern. You have to pay close attention. So it's a hybrid of a standard checkerboard. It features 3 colors, and the original textile was unavailable for this particular garment. Here are some images of the finished garment front and back. For that, coming just below the knee. And this too was, I think, speaks to Alma Thomas's modesty in her self-fashioning. The Whitney design is also based upon a grid. Typically, they'll turn at a 45-degree angle. It features about 10 colors in total. The original textile was unavailable, but the colors align with what we see in the imagery, as well with the colors during the late 60s and early 70s that would have been popular for this type of garment. Here we have Alma featured in the gown, as well as the front and the back of the gown with the particular details that you can see here. There were several challenges during the completion of these 2 garments. The last couple of years, I think, have been a challenge for everyone in different ways, but particularly with COVID. Everything changed very quickly for most of us. And for me, I was very distracted during COVID. And I did find it was harder for me to do the work, but I'm very appreciative in being able to work with the curators who were both very gracious about my time and my work, as well as timelines. Not to mention, sometimes in the process of creating these, we had several deaths that were reported related to policing. And again, it became very hard for me to concentrate on several occasions. I experienced, just to give you a little bit more insight into the actual happenings and construction process, my work initially starts with creating graphics and then having those graphics printed on fabric. And in the first 6 months of COVID, with teaching online every day, as well as moving and just about anything else that could happen during that time, I went through 2 or 3 computers. They just stopped working. I had shoddy access to internet after having to move, as well as I became a distraction myself with respect to just trying to work every day and how I worked, because I like to work in the middle of the night. It's not always conducive to do that. There were challenges I had with the graphics. There were challenges with the fabric and construction, as well as time and space for that. But I understand that my time is coming to an end. And I would just like to say that this has been just a wonderful journey. I'm excited for the opportunity for my work to be shown along the images and the work of Alma Thomas. And I hope that everyone is going to be able to see the exhibition as it is in DC, which is local for many of us, but also traveling around the country. So thank you so very much, everyone, for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stevens. I think the hardest part of being a moderator is to have to cut off your speakers when the presentations are going so well as expected. And so I really apologize. I really enjoyed both presentations. Once again, my thanks to Dr. Barber for walking us through how Thomas used photography to self-identify, for his self-fashioning and identity, and to Dr. Stevens for recreating how that photography, or what we saw in the photography, came to be by recreating the dresses for the exhibition. Thank you so much. And also for adding your positionality in terms of what you went through, even through this process. We don't often hear that in presentations. And I think that was very important for us to hear. So thank you to both presenters once again. I will now hand over to the third session to my colleague, Dr. Yolanda Pierce, to take us through the third session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here this afternoon. My name is Yolanda Pierce. I am professor and dean at Howard University School of Divinity. I am here to moderate the panel that is going to be talking about spirituality in both Thomas and Driskell. It is my pleasure to introduce the two panelists for this session. The first is Dr. Melanie Harvey. She is an assistant professor of art history in the Department of Art at Howard University. And during 2020 to 2021 academic year, she was in residence as the Paul Mellon Guest Scholar at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art. And our second panelist will be Dr. Deborah Ambush. Dr. Deborah Ambush currently serves as a research associate, adjunct faculty member, and member of the faculty leadership team at the Luce Center for Arts and Religion at Wesley Theological Seminary. She's a 2021 graduate of Wesley Theological Seminary, a Master of Arts graduate with certificates in arts and theology, as well as in African American church studies. So first we will hear from Dr. Harvey. She will then be followed by Dr. Ambush, and then I will return to hand the session over to my colleagues. Dr. Harvey.
Thank you so much, Dean Pierce, for that introduction. And I'm very happy to share really some new work on Alma Thomas and her paintings. So I'll begin. My research for the catalog for the Alma Thomas Everything is Beautiful exhibition focused on Thomas's relationship with her home church, St. Luke's Episcopal Church. During the research process, combing through her personal papers at the Smithsonian Archive of American Art, I was searching for evidence of consistent religious practice that linked her to the congregation through traditional means, such as attending weekly services or affiliation with church organizations. But when I was unable to locate such evidence, it became clear that the evidence I was searching for was present in her art. Paintings such as Resurrection testify to her sustained reflection on religious themes. When one stands in front of the walls of religious paintings in the exhibition, Alma Thomas, Everything is Beautiful, examining They Laid Him in the Tomb, painted around 1958, or St. Cecilia at the Organ, Etude in Brown of 1962, and The Three Wise Men, painted in 1966, it becomes clear that religious themes were always present, evidencing a religio-aesthetic practice that emphasizes religious motifs as an expression of her Christian and Episcopalian faith. Across her archives, I've been able to find documentation of at least 11 paintings where Thomas examined religious motifs. Alma Thomas is a part of a host of artists that produced religious art, engaging modernist principles, debunking the notion that modern art was secular and disinterested in religious themes. The Alma Thomas papers reveal that her religious paintings were spiritual dialogic exercises that reveal her engagement with aspects of Episcopalian liturgy. During the mid-1950s, Alma Thomas painted the subject of the 14th Station of the Cross. They laid him in the tomb. Episcopalian descriptions of this final scene of Christ's crucifixion and death state, quote, "When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn in the rock," end quote. Thomas translated this scene using modernist characteristics of abstraction and emphasizing the painted surface through contrast and color. Using pale yellow hues to reference the body of Christ and those transporting his body, Thomas frames bodies in motion through Black tones that are balanced by the use of planes that transition from red to green, creating a rhythm in the composition that reiterates the movement central to the painting. I'm grateful that my fellow panelist, Dr. Deborah Ambush, brought it to my attention that during the 1970s, and perhaps even earlier, artistic representations of the Stations of the Cross lined the walls of Thomas's home church, St. Luke's. In addition to exemplifying her reflection on aspects of Episcopalian liturgy through the Stations of the Cross, it's possible that Alma Thomas was inspired to take on this subject from encounters with the theme of the deposition in European prints from the 16th, 17th, and 18th century that were on view at the National Gallery of Art, which she regularly visited, and exhibitions of the Rosenwald Collection in 1950 and the Crest Collection in 1956. And after searching through the Phillips collection holdings, I came across George Ruwalt's Yellow Christ of 1937, which entered the Phillips collection in 1939. The similarities in the palette of this painting and Thomas's "They Laid Him in the Tomb" makes me wonder if perhaps Thomas may have seen this painting on view at the Phillips collection. In 1962, she even clipped out a Sunday Star newspaper article on art and religion that included a reproduction of Caravaggio's The Deposition, demonstrating her sustained interest in religious art. During the early 1960s, as the feminist movement was gaining momentum, Alma Thomas painted St. Cecilia at the organ, St. Teresa at the altar, as well as an abstract painting of St. Catherine. She completed these compositions on women saints engaged in Christian liturgy only 1 year after the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women was announced, which prompted the American public to think critically about discriminatory practices that restricted women's rights to equal participation in American life. These paintings can be understood as Thomas's effort to reclaim the role and contribution of women in Christian biblical narratives and hagiography. These paintings also open up the possibility that Thomas was creating art that engaged local DC art collections. Artistic compositions of St. Cecilia at the organ were exhibited at the National Gallery of Art, including Ulo Crino's St. Cecilia of the early 16th century, which joined the Crest collection at the National Gallery of Art in 1957. The placement of Thomas's religious art in the public sphere section of the Alma Thomas Everything is Beautiful exhibition is an interpretive gesture toward an important aspect of Thomas's religious life. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Alma Thomas consistently exhibited her art in group exhibitions, including the Washington Religious Art Exhibition, sponsored by the National Conference of Christians and Jews, an exhibition of paintings and sculptures by the members of the Society of Washington Artists at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Chevy Chase, Maryland, a traveling exhibition of American paintings circulated by the College Art Service and curated by influential scholar of African American art, Dr. Richard A. Long. And finally, an exhibition for the Arts Teachers Festival, sponsored by the Architects' Wives Association and mounted at the national headquarters for the historically African American sorority, Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated, located on New Hampshire Avenue Northwest, about 5 blocks from Thomas's home. So as much as we recognize Alma Thomas today for her signature Alma stripes, it should be noted that during the 1960s, she would have been notable for her modernist interpretations of religious themes. In fact, in 1961, an art review published in the Washington Post acknowledged Thomas for her, quote, strong study of St. Catherine's in stained glass window colors, end quote. The following year, Thomas's St. Cecilia at the Organ was mentioned by the Washington Post in an article entitled, Can Modern Art Be Religious?, which highlighted the painting's infinitely pleasing, luscious colors. Paintings from the 1960s, such as Genesis and Transcendental, suggest religious themes served as a stylistic bridge as she developed her signature style. Paintings like Genesis frame her examination of nature in theological and philosophical frameworks. Akin to the biblical narrative of God creating the universe and earth out of a dark void, Thomas designed her saturated gradient tones of purple, green, yellow, and red as emerging from deep blue forms. This is similar to Transcendental, where saturated forms push against and through Black watercolor patterns. So these 1960 watercolor compositions are a prelude to her signature paintings from the 1970s, such as Spring Flowers near Jefferson Memorial and Ruth Canaan's Amaryllis, artworks that extend her interest in and reflection on God's creation. So how do we understand the presence of religious themes in Alma Thomas's body of art? Contemporary artist and scholar Makoto Fujimura provides insight. In his 2020 publication, Art and Faith, A Theology of Making, Fujimura describes the relationship between art making and liberation that is particularly useful for understanding the religious art of Alma Thomas. Fujimura asserts, when we build, design, and depict on this side of eternity matters, because in some mysterious way, those creations become part of the future city of God. Even in seeking justice and fighting against injustices of the world, if we do not depict future hopes, as Martin Luther King did in his I Have a Dream speech, we will be constantly defined by the opposition or the power of oppression. Art can be a means to liberate us from such oppression by depicting the world as beauty and truth to point to the new, end quote. Considering her exhibition record of religious paintings, Thomas was quite confident in believing that her religious painting's spiritual and formalist impact would advance what Fujimura refers to as the future city of God, as evidence that indeed art, beauty, and the pursuit of new visual vocabularies can liberate the painter and viewer from contemporary circumstances of oppression. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harvey. And now Dr. Ambush.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank the Phillips Collection for the invitation to participate in this symposium. And I'd like to dedicate my brief remarks to the students and faculty at Talladega College. The persimmon remnants of autumn's warming sun rays seem to gently seek out and rest upon the wisdom lines of Dr. Driskell's profile as he stands in front of DeForest Chapel on the campus of Talladega College. His trajectory from the penning of a handwritten 1955 employment application, where he makes it clear that he sees the role of God is important in what he is about to do as a teacher. This brings us to a seldom explored dimension in the life of the late Honorable Dr. David C. Driskell and his work over a lifetime, and how this might be likened to the work of a theologian. The emergent discipline of African American church studies, which concerns himself with a discrete academic enterprise centered on worship life, ecclesiastical practices, and theological understanding of African American churches, affords us this very opportunity to explore such a proposition in theological terms. Driskell's work has always been imbued with the visual iconography of a Black sacred cosmos. According to sociologists and theologians Eric Lincoln and Lawrence Mamiya, the Black sacred cosmos, or the religious worldview of African Americans, is related both to their African heritage, which envisions the whole universe as sacred, and their conversion to Christianity during slavery and its aftermath. Recent scholarship on African Americans brings us to an understanding of the power of how he approached it. Driskell is in possession of his father's books where he wrote his sermons. He describes them as beautiful and notes that they are drawings on some of the pages that includes drawings of angels that he did just for himself. He began drawing on the clean pages of his father's theology books, he himself drawing cars. His father's angels, as Jan Tyler relates in 2014, were doodled on the back of his sermon notes, but they are treasured remembrances of his father. The angel encompasses every cubic inch in this silk screen of the breathable air. And in the time of Jim Crow, there is a covenantal seal, a community seal enveloping the tabernacle. This is Dr. Driskell in his first year of teaching at Talladega College. This is the front of the first commission that I'll talk about, which is People's Congregational Church, United Church of Christ. The pastorate for some 30 years was A. Knight and Stanley. And in a remarkable span of time, their initial relationship as teacher and student now has come full circle, as Reverend Stanley has now become Driskell's pastor. And it is under his pastorship that Driskell creates these windows. Driskell reads as an Afrofuturist who reads the rightness of the spiritual landscape for his own visions as they would apply to the work he wanted to do in order to dismantle segregational oppression. He had experience leading and encouraging students in the shadow of the death of Emmett Till, while also having crosses burned in front of DeForest Chapel, which I'll talk about later. Talladega College provided fertile ground for fully understanding the fullness of Driskell's life in three important ways. First, he is exposed to the evolving apocalyptic eschatological tenets that define the primarily Black Congregationalist community. It's indelibly shaped by the lived experiences of the descendants of Talladega ancestors, and this affects his iconography selections. Secondly, he is heir to an institutional liturgical mode of expression that embodies the interiority of the campus. These things show up at People's Congregational Church in the form of iconography. When he leaves Talladega in 1962 and officially becomes a faculty member of Howard University, he has formulated a distinctive, transformative aesthetic curriculum architecture that activates a pedagogical approach imbued with civil rights, social action, and based in Exodus, becoming the seat of the heart of his career. According to Julie McGee, the windows of People's Congregational Church were developed with a planned new sanctuary meant to be an architectural expression of African-American religious experience. The Black Sacred Cosmos is centered in a parallel construction of iconographies based on the life of Jesus. In the female Christ, we see the representations of Alpha and Omega, the Amistad ship, which figures prominently in the Congregationalist denominational tradition as the AMA involvement. You also see that it plays a double time existence as the old ship of Zion. Take note of the fish and also take note of the wheel in the middle of the wheel. Take note of the eye of God. Take note of all of the spirituals that come forth in these windows. The theme of freedom also loudly resounds in Driskell's creation of these stained windows. I'd now like to briefly just give you a little bit of information about Talladega College, the second commission. The DeForest Chapel, as Driskell saw it, he wanted the themes to be related to heroes, to heritage, and to discipline. To give you an idea of how dramatically different what Driskell was able to do with the windows of the chapel, I offer here a picture from the early 20th century in comparison to the completion of Driskell's windows at DeForest Chapel. In the North Facade, it's devoted to the heritage windows. And here he does something incredibly unusual with these windows. We can see that the seal of Talladega College is here, but we also see 6 African masks, the Baloo mask representing Cote d'Ivoire, and he has paired it with the cotton crop. With the Shante fertility doll from Ghana, he has paired it with the peanut, with the Mende mask from Sierra Leone, aligned with the sweet potato, and in Benin, Nigeria, he has aligned it with the peach. The Dan mask is aligned with Liberia, and the sugarcane crop is represented. The Kota mask is from Gabon with the pokeberry. An interesting take on this is his decision to do so with the grouping of these plants. I believe that he was raising up the medicinal purposes and also the overcoming through oppression and how people owned their own heritage coming together in Talladega. I bring here to your attention the Kokomo glass, the German fine glass, the Wismach kinds of glass. These are really ornate stained glass windows. The architectural style is Romanesque, and you can see in the repetitive pattern all of the things coming together. His dramatic contrast in the tradition of what a stained glass window would be, and his ode to heritage is evident here. I now bring to your attention his rendering of biblical flowers, which he paired in tribute to heroes, Mary Bethune, Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Malcolm X, Bill Cosby, Marian Anderson, Robinson, all of these, Jackie Robinson, all of these heroes come together in this sacred space to give tribute. This is what the windows appear like in this chapel, in DeForest Chapel. And on the day that I got to do my research visit, one of the things that I was most moved by is that the choir was actually singing. And I knew that Dr. Driskell would be pleased. One of the last themes that he had in the DeForest Chapel was the theme of disciplines. He wanted people to remember the disciplines and their role in the college. For example, if we just look at the discipline of athletics, if you look at the picture on the right of the swimming pool, I wanted to bring to your attention that the swimming pool was only in existence because graduate programs would not admit Blacks because they did not have a swimming credit. So what Talladega did was to create a swimming pool that would allow the undergraduates to finish their matriculation and be able to go and enter into graduate programs. So I thought it would be nice for you all to see this too. One of the final images that I'll leave you with is the Centennial Arts Festival cover, which Driskell created some years later. He kept close ties with the school. He wanted to complement the theme and make an artist statement that reads, "The circle symbolizes the 100 years of progress, and the black disc is the strength of her loyal sons and daughters. This column symbolizes the liberal arts tradition, and the tree is truth held so dearly at Talladega College, the growth of knowledge for all mankind, regardless of race, creed, and color." The second image I'll leave you with is an untitled angel, possibly a tribute to his mother, whose death coincided near the time of the dedication of the People's Congregational Windows. The organic nature of the angel's wings, uncharacteristically now at rest, give us entree to how the watercolors the stained glass window maker would have had to interpret. And it telegraphs all the ways of knowing his mother imparted to Driskell. She is a maker of things, and the translucency of colors recalling pokeberry juice stains and plant dyes assures us that something special, something we need to attend to, has been incarnated in this small town of Talladega. I'd like to thank Dr. David Conway, Perry Trice, Adrian Childs, and Aaron Rosen and Devin Abbots. Thank you.
Thank you so much for two incredibly rich presentations, Dr. Harvey, Dr. Ambush. The intersections of faith, spirituality, theology, racial identity, and then beautiful, beautiful art. It is such a rich source for conversation, particularly around racial identity and the African-American context. And I would add here that both artists embody the eschatological hope that is inherent in their work and in the communities in which they served. I am now happy to turn us over to the next panel. Dr. Childs, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. And I invite Lisa Farrington to join me.
Thank you, Dr. Childs. I'm back, everybody, from the beginning of the program, and excited to converse with Dr. Childs about the relationship between David Driskell and Alma Thomas and the ways in which their art and their lives dovetailed.
Indeed. And just as a brief introduction, I'm Adrian Childs, adjunct curator at the Phillips collection, and you can introduce yourself, Lisa.
Sure. For those of you who missed me at the beginning of the program, I am Dr. Lisa Farrington from Howard University, art historian specializing in the art of African-American women. So I'm delighted to be here, and the talks of my colleagues have just been fantastic, and it's been a pleasure to be part of this program. So
Indeed.
the first thing I
I
noticed, Adrian, that
yeah.
in this first slide, tell me about that painting that's in the background.
Well, yeah, that's really a good question because obviously we have the beautiful portraits of the two artists at different times in their lives, but the background is actually a painting that Alma Thomas gave to David Driskell, and it was in their family collection for many years. It was a painting that went on tour with the exhibition Narratives of African American Art and Identity that showcased David Driskell's collection in the 90s and the 90s that I helped to work on. So it's a very special kind of connection between them. And I think it's a good idea we're going to do an informal conversation for those of you out there. But it's important to share where their lives converge and where their works, converge, and where the works diverge, and to see what we can learn about them, not just through their personal relationship, but through the way their art developed. But, they had similar sort of points, aspects of the biography, right?
Adrian, can you just go back to that first slide if you don't mind?
Yes,
I just wanted to remark, given the wonderful talks that Professors Ambush and Harvey gave, that isn't it interesting that in the photograph you chose, Adrian, there's a Gothic window in the background, almost creating a kind of a church-like, a cathedral-like environment. That's how I see him too, kind of miraculous. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Yeah. But in terms of their biography, the fact that they're educators, right, is I think important. What do you think?
Well, this is a legacy that is not unusual in practitioners of African American art history. There is the component of teaching as well as art making. This is true of so many, James Porter, Faith Ringgold. I mean, the Afro-Cobra artists at Howard in the 60s, so many of the artists felt an obligation to teach African-American art and art in general to their students. And some of you may not know that I graduated from the College of Fine Arts at Howard University many years ago. We don't have to say how many. And David Driskell taught us a special class at Howard University on the history of African-American art, right at the time when his 2 centuries catalog and exhibition was traveling the globe. And I was 19 years old, maybe, when I took that class, and he walked into the room and completely changed my perception of, assuming I had one, of what an African-American academic and scholar is supposed to be like. He was eloquent, he was lucid, he told us not only about the history of African-American art, literally from slavery to that moment, but he also talked about how when he traveled with the exhibition to South Africa, he had to be identified in his passport as an honorary white in order to travel appropriately during apartheid. And he just taught about life, not just about art history. And he taught by example. This is what a Black scholar looks like. And I have tried very hard to pattern myself after that amazing man.
Yeah, I agree. But I think that one thing that we don't often think about is sort of the practicality of being an artist. We sort of talked about all the artists that all the Black artists that were also educators. You had to make money. You had to you had to have
pay your rent.
You had to pay. So you start there, but where people like Driskell and Thomas, they enriched their students so much, and I feel like as a teacher, you get enriched by that experience as well. Absolutely. And so I think that their practice gets more expansive with the more you interact with other people. And for Driskell, certainly he's kept relationships with his students his whole life. They were students, and then he's curating them. And I was a student, and we ended up working together.
Yeah.
So all of these relationships impact your whole life. But so this is a really great way to think of them, their parallels, you know, how they both started out as educators. And I think that gives them, like I said, a more expansive view of what's possible, because you're always, you know, telling people, you know, trying to encourage your students about what's possible. And I think it gives you a kind of a boost as well in that way.
It's true. And yeah, sorry.
No, I was just, you know, always conscious of time. But and another way that they intersect, and another way that what really kind of circumscribes their work in many ways, or at least a lot of the narratives we've been talking about of their work, is nature, right? They're nature lovers, and these are two great photographs of them at totally different times in their lives and careers, but their bodies in nature. And I did a presentation recently at the Driskell Center and I listened to some people talking about landscape, because they're doing a big show on landscape there, and thinking about the 19th century, thinking about American landscapes, the historical landscapes, and what Black bodies labored and suffered in. And I think about that landscape being totally transformed by these two artists, and they just lean in, you know, they take nature as something glorious, and they take ownership out of it and make it beautiful, and kind of heal some of those past kind of the blood-stained landscapes of American South. And maybe that's not a fair comparison, but I do feel like there's something very healing and refreshing about a Black artist who can unapologetically own the land.
Yeah, well, you know, when I agree, Adrienne, when Alma Thomas was asked why during this very political decades that she was doing these classic works of hers, she did not engage politics on a regular basis, her response was that she preferred in her art not to focus on man's inhumanity to man, which is what politics was at the time. But she spent her entire adult life teaching in the DC public school system. This is a real legacy. And feeling through her experience of nature that there must be a way to express that experience on canvas, because engaging with nature, as we learned in the previous two talks, is a way of engaging with the spiritual. Now, you told me, Adrienne, that you did spend some time in Maine at Driskell's home, which is where the photograph of Driskell was taken. Tell us about his summer home and the experience of being there.
Well, a lot of people know about his early trip to Skowhegan, not his trip, going to Skowhegan as a student from Howard was a great honor, and falling in love with the landscape there. And then he used to say, I think that all famous artists, I mean, of course, this is tongue in cheek, but all famous artists go to Maine and have summer homes there. So I think I must do that. And of course, he was a young person at the time. His wife thought, what are you talking about? But of course, determined and very resourceful. That's exactly what he did, and built his home, built a garden. And of course, he grew up on the land, a farm. So this is totally natural to him to have this kind of space, but it was really a special place. And by the time I went, it was years later, he built a large house and a studio and a garden. There was a little brook running through the back. And every time you go and visit, you'd have to go outside. And so it's just very much part of his personal way of life. But these things trickle into or really frame the work.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
the early, both of them come through a really traditional academic tradition, right? Like traditional.
They were taught in the style of early modernism,
right?
A cubism, a post-impressionism, absolutely.
And they both went in different directions, but maybe is it an evolution? Is that what we think? Is this why we still, I don't know if you can answer this, in art school, do they still go through this kind of traditional?
Not so much. No, I mean, I taught for 15 years at Parsons School of Design in New York, and that's not the tradition any longer. Traditions are now the postmodern traditions of multimedia and conceptual art and so forth. So, but at the time that, certainly when Alma Thomas was studying, and then later Driskell, this was the staple. This was what you learned. You learned, you know, Van Gogh, Cezanne, Picasso, Matisse, Derain, you know, that's what you were supposed to know about. And so of course they start there, but all great artists start with learning what their teachers think they should learn, and then you break out of that. Picasso did the same thing. You learn the basics, but then you find your own path. And both of them did exactly that from these, you know, diverging from these early years over time.
Yes, indeed. And I also think that the colors, though, they remain true to their sense of color throughout, because I'm looking at those greens in Alma Thomas piece. And this is when she went back to school at AU and took classes. And I don't know whether she had retired at that point yet. I know she was involved in the little Paris group with Lois Jones,
Yes,
where they
yes.
they were experimenting with French modernism that Lois Jones had adapted when she went to Paris. So there's a lot of dialogue going on, but it was still a fairly conservative approach than to what, of course, what we know will come later.
Right.
And both of them did early landscapes, but very naturalistic. I mean, what would we say?
Relatively, yes. Mm-hmm.
Relatively. I mean, compared to what they would end up doing.
Right.
David Driskell's My Father's Farm this is a little, almost like a poem, a little sonnet.
I think you mentioned to me earlier that it has this quality of the Barbizon school, of the sort of Hudson River type landscapes, and it really does. But it remains, I keep going back to the previous talks, very much a spiritual expression of God and nature.
And he had just completed his time at Howard University in 1955, going down to drive to Talladega to take on his first job. Think about that. You can, to be able to be hired as a professor right out of undergrad, that's another conversation. But really, he came at a time when there were so many great opportunities and he took advantage of them. But anyway, he's on his way down to his father and stops in his father's farm at home to say hello to his parents, to greet them. And then he does this little study of that memory. So it's about memory, you know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then of course, yeah.
And then Thomas's work, what's interesting about Thomas's landscape is even here, she's starting to move away toward non-representational art. You can see that in the brushstrokes, you can see that in the abstraction of the landscape. Even though it's still recognizable, she's already moving towards something much more transcendental, much more abstract.
Mm-hmm. But you know, it's interesting, they both still have some depth to them, because they're going to end up being people who are dealing with the surface. I mean, there are painters who don't deal with a lot of depth. I guess you'd call that modernist, but they abandon all of that pretense for the picture plane.
Well said.
Yeah. And of course, we heard earlier about religion and a little bit about social justice, but about Alma Thomas's religious work, which I thought was really interesting. Bravo, Melanie. And I didn't really know about it, but both of them dabbled in some kind of social justice issues.
Yeah, we see that on the left, the painting referencing the March on Washington by Thomas, and then on the right, the reference to Emmett Till as a sacrificial lamb posed as Christ in the Driskell painting. And we were talking the other day about how relevant the Driskell painting is to George Floyd and to what we're dealing with today. Talk about sacrificial lambs. These things are still relevant, but neither of them stayed there in their painting. Neither of them stayed in political or agitprop art, but they did feel that need, and they certainly were engaged personally in their lives in politics.
Yes, and both of them here are reacting to something that's happening on the ground. Driskell's reacting to the murder of Emmett Till, but like you said, couches it in this religious um, iconography of presenting the body, the beaten body of Christ slash Emmett Till in church, just as his mother presented his horribly disfigured body
Yes.
to the congregation. So he's really going there in ways that that is very emotional, I think. And then Alma Thomas, of course, a sketch for March on Washington, the painting she does, but that was a very emotional time and a very public. I mean, it's a huge moment in DC, not just DC politics, but for people who live there. That March on Washington was a huge moment.
Right.
But like you said, they don't stay there. I think that, well, Driskell has talked about it, and I think that someone also mentioned Alma Thomas remarking about the way she wanted her art to be her expressed in terms of beauty and nature, as opposed to these social issues.
But you know, in Alma Thomas's March on Washington picture, what's interesting is that just as in her floral abstractions, here she creates the feeling, the experience of the march, as opposed to some illustrative, figural, realistic representation. So that's really what abstraction is all about, expressing an experience rather than a visual reality.
Right. Oh, that's true. And so then she goes, and this is in the 60s, she's already started with the abstraction, right?
Right.
But, I thought that there was a moment in Driskell's work that I thought was really reflective of Thomas. And even though he did earlier work that had these modular brushstrokes and modular shapes, in the 70s, he has a period where his landscapes feature these dabs. And this is, of course, how Thomas was by the 70s. She was full on with her signature style. But, he had curated an exhibition of hers at Fisk.
Exactly.
And it might have been in 1972 or 71. And he was in, at the art gallery at Howard, so I think that he's one that was always closely looking at other people's art, obviously, because he's curating and doing all of that. And so I just felt like this was a place where they intersect.
It's a wonderful comparison. But you feel that the subtle difference, of course, is that his canvas is much more fluid. It's much softer, in the demarcation lines are much softer, and you get a more sort of gauzy, cloud-like experience versus an active composition in the Thomas. But there's a lot to be said about how similar these are.
Right. And then even the under painting, and you have a feeling that there might be something under there that might be recognizable in his, more so necessarily than hers. But you're right, it is a very different in terms of the approach. But he continued on in this vein. And here's Sunshine Frozen. And then you think about him doing dematerialized, trying to paint something like sunshine that you can't paint. Just like the prior piece by Thomas was cumulus, it's a cloud. So it's very hard to paint something like that. And so you get this sort of this explosion of white to try to approximate what frozen sunshine might look like. I guess it's conceptual.
Absolutely. I mean, what artists do when they paint abstraction is they paint their experience of a scene. And both of them, in this excellent comparison, by the way, Adrian, they are doing that. They are expressing how they felt, how they thought, how they experienced a visual reality, and they're doing it in strangely similar ways with these sort of little mosaic kind of tesserae strokes that really explode, as you put it, on the canvas.
Mhm. Yeah, Driskell often talked about him translating his vision, which for the audience, for the viewer, and that his vision is it's never going to look exactly like whatever it is. And
Yeah.
but he's trying to bring out some kind of truth that
Yeah.
you can't necessarily see, that the artist is a medium for a kind of a truth. And so he was always in search of that creative truth, he would often say. And we have about 3 more minutes. And so, but then they do go on their own directions. And you know, Driskell has so many different types of iconography or subjects.
And styles.
Right, and styles. And so I felt like these two were really interesting in some ways, how parallel they are, and then they have parallel lines. Isn't that nice? And then how they diverge. They diverge and converge. But I mean, and he's looking at Yoruba posts. He's looking at West African architecture and thinking about that, and then developing his strip collage aesthetic.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about it as a kind of cultural memory on canvas. I like that idea.
Oh yeah, yeah. Thank you for reminding. When I can always say something when not everybody's listening, and then I forget them.
I remember everything you say.
And Thomas, I think when she gets into her zone, stays in their zone. So what do you think about, how do we interpret that?
Well, I mean, I think on many levels, Thomas was able to completely let go of any kind of visual language that we're used to. And she was a colorist. She painted how she was feeling at the moment. She had an amazing eye for color harmonies. And at some point, we have to go with her and let go of the narrative and just enjoy the image and how it makes us feel. And unfortunately for everyone watching, these little tiny pictures on a computer screen do not do justice to some of Thomas's massive canvases, where you are almost swallowed up by the feeling that a certain color gives you, a certain movement gives you. You know, vertical lines, for example, are very static and very still, which is a wonderful counterpoint to the wildly wonderful color scheme. It's an amazing aesthetic choice to put those two together. So I can't say enough about that.
And it's interesting how, because they are similar in some ways, obviously there's a similar approach, but when you get into the gallery and see them all together, they are all different.
Yeah.
And it's a different experience. It's a different experience. So
it's wonderful that the Phillips has these shows overlapping, because if you go to the exhibits, you can kind of peek at them both at the same time, and it's very powerful.
Yes, it does. They have a lot of, they work in tandem in so many ways. And that's one of the reasons I thought this was an interesting comparison. You talk about the Driskell's interest in flowers and his memory in Woman with Flowers. This woman could be his mother, his wife, his daughter, but thinking of sort of the archetype of the Black female with a bouquet of bursting flowers. Somehow resonates to me with Alma Thomas's Spring Flowers.
It does. Well, you know, I was thinking about this last night. Driskell, it honors this Black woman who is holding this bouquet of flowers. Flowers are symbolic of fecundity and spring and nurturing and growth, all the things that Driskell wants to associate with the Black woman. And then we have an actual Black woman who is expressing joy, nature, fecundity, and growth. And I think it's a perfect pairing to end on for this deep dive.
Deep dive. Yes, I really enjoyed talking with you about this, and we could talk forever. I wanted to leave our viewers with this last photograph of David Driskell and Alma Thomas together in her kitchen. studio. And they were photographed by Frank Stewart, who David invited to go to Alma Thomas's house that day and take some photos. So the photos we see of her by him are from that shoot that day. But this is just a nice intimate shot of them sitting there.
Amazing.
Shot talking. And thank you so much. And I'm going to stop sharing, and then Lisa is going to take us into our next part of the program. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Adrienne. So we will now end the program with a special tribute to Alma Thomas, penned by poet Ross Gay and entitled Study for Resurrection, Always With and For Beloveds. We are honored to present Taylor Crawford and Curtis Melrose, senior theater arts majors from the Chadwick A. Boseman College of Fine Arts at Howard University, performing an excerpt from the poem, accompanied by a dance montage choreographed by Tara Lynn Jones, Pascal Rialt, Royce Zachary, and Afosua Abiola. We would like to acknowledge Howard alumnus Araku Abiola, the director, editor, and cinematographer, and extend heartfelt thanks to Dr. Afosua Abiola, who is the interim chair of the Department of Theater Arts, for coordinating the video production. Enjoy this.
This, Alma, out the window, the light through the holly tree, the seams in, the seams of. She called it
Study for Resurrection, she called it.
Wind and Crepe Myrtle Concerto. She called it Cherry Blossom Symphony. Those are the right words.
Mine is a sycamore. No, please let me correct that, will you? I am the sycamore. Have always been. The painting actually was untitled, but it was Study for Resurrection. The mottled body stretching above and beneath me, the leaves big as kites as encyclopedia pages, the lights as the seams. This, Alma.
Witness is a kind of making. I am the black walnuts, the stand of beeches, the dandelions and hydrangeas, and sweet potatoes and okras. I am the long beans and the marigolds and the fish peppers and the burdocks and the comfreys and hibiscuses. Take some seeds with you. Take some cutting. Take some, oh, thank you.
You might call it Forsythia Glow. You might call it
Study for Resurrection. Epistles from the centuries delivered from every breath if we read them. Okra seed black peanut. Wasp perusing the collards. You might see it. You might call it.
Sometimes we forget.
Earthworm tunneling hibiscus. Skits coddling the wind. Softest thing on this planet. Your eyelid.
Requires witness sometimes. Requires witness sometimes. We forget such witness makes a world. I mean the earth. A remaking. A we-making to the earth. Such witness, I am saying, witnesses our possible lives into being. And sometimes we forget the oh thank you.
We are made of light, in the holly tree as the seams.
Study for resurrection.
Sometimes we forget and are reminded the dahlia's gaudy frock and night blooming jasmine tiptoeing in pajamas and socks.
Into the dream lights the seams of the we. She witnessed us.
A garden, light as the seams.
She put the gardens in our eyes.